10,926 dead, over 165,000 injured, nearly 2.25 million people displaced from their homes. Those numbers were read out loud, in public, by the president of Peru, standing in the middle of Lima's central plaza. And then she made one thing very clear: none of it actually happened. Not yet. This past week, Peru ran one of the largest disaster preparedness exercises in its history. A nationwide simulation of a magnitude 8.8 earthquake striking just off the coast of the capital, followed by a tsunami slamming into one of the most densely populated stretches of coastline in South America. It was a drill. Nobody died. No building actually collapsed. But the number 8.8 wasn't picked out of thin air for dramatic effect. And the casualty figures the government read out weren't invented for shock value either. They came from real geological data, real historical earthquake records, and a real, scientifically documented gap in the Earth's crust, sitting directly beneath one of the largest cities in the Western Hemisphere. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what happened during this drill, why Peru chose the number 8.8 specifically rather than some other magnitude, and why scientists who study this exact stretch of coastline have been warning for years that Lima isn't just vulnerable to a mega earthquake, it may already be overdue for one. On Friday, August 14, 2026, Peru's National Institute of Civil Defense, an agency known by its Spanish acronym INDECSI, coordinated the country's second national multi-hazard drill of the year, activating simulated emergency protocols across every region of the country simultaneously. This wasn't a small, localized exercise. It was a full nationwide activation. And the scenario, at its core, was about as severe as Peruvian disaster planners are able to model. A magnitude 8.8 earthquake, centered roughly 60 kilometers west of Callao, the port city that sits directly adjacent to Lima, followed immediately by a tsunami warning sent out to mobile phones across the entire coastal region. President Keiko Fujimori personally led the exercise from Lima's Plaza Mayor, the historic square that's home to the country's government palace, City Hall, and the capital's cathedral, before moving to a mobile command post to receive a stream of hypothetical damage reports as the simulated disaster unfolded in real time. At one point, addressing the country directly, she read out what she described as the report she would have to deliver if this had been a real event. 10,126 people dead, 165,160 injured, and 199,818 people displaced from their homes. She was explicit that every part of the scenario was simulated. She was equally explicit that the risk behind it is not. The drill itself unfolded in 3 coordinated stages. First, the activation of alerts and the movement of people into internal safe zones, essentially the drop, cover, and hold on phase most people associate with earthquake drills. Second, a full evacuation phase, moving people out of buildings and along pre-established routes toward open outdoor areas away from structures that could collapse. And third, a sustained period where participants remained in designated outdoor zones under the guidance of trained emergency volunteers until officials formally closed out the exercise. Crucially, the scenario wasn't identical everywhere in the country because Peru's geography creates wildly different secondary hazards depending on region. Along the coast, the drill recreated an earthquake followed by a tsunami. In the highlands, the simulated threat shifted to landslides and mudflows, the kind of secondary hazard that violent shaking triggers on steep Andean terrain. And in the jungle regions of the Amazon basin, the scenario simulated heavy rainfall and river flooding. That regional breakdown came directly from Hernando Tavera, president of Peru's Geophysical Institute, underscoring that this exercise wasn't just modeling a single earthquake, it was modeling the full cascade of disasters a megaquake of this scale could trigger across completely different terrain hundreds of miles apart. In the coastal district of La Punta, in Callao, one of the areas most directly exposed to a tsunami-generating earthquake, residents specifically rehearsed something called vertical evacuation, moving upward into taller, structurally reinforced buildings rather than trying to outrun a wave on foot, a strategy used in low-lying coastal areas where there simply isn't time or high ground nearby to evacuate horizontally before a tsunami arrives. 2 details about the timing and framing of this drill are worth sitting with, because neither one was accidental. First, the timing. Peru scheduled this drill for August 14th, specifically to fall one day before the anniversary of one of the deadliest earthquakes in the country's recent history, the magnitude 7.9 earthquake that struck the Ica region on August 15, 2007, devastating the town of Pisco and triggering a tsunami that struck the port there directly. That earthquake killed more than 500 people, the overwhelming majority of them in Pisco alone, and it remains a defining reference point in Peru's modern disaster planning, precisely because it demonstrated, within living memory, exactly how quickly a subduction zone earthquake off this coast can turn deadly. running a national megaquake drill. On the eve of that anniversary wasn't a coincidence. It was a deliberate reminder that the last major earthquake to hit this stretch of coast is well within recent memory, not some distant historical footnote. Second, the immediate trigger. Officials in Peru pointed directly to a string of recent earthquakes in neighboring Colombia and Venezuela as part of the motivation for running this particular exercise now, treating regional seismic activity elsewhere on the continent as a prompt to test the country's own readiness rather than assuming a mega quake next door has no bearing on the risk closer to home. But the choice of magnitude 8.8 specifically is where this story stops being about drill logistics and starts being about hard geological data. That number isn't a round figure chosen simply because it sounds catastrophic. It's a direct callback to a real earthquake that already happened on this exact stretch of coastline centuries ago, and to a body of modern scientific research suggesting the underlying process behind that earthquake may be approaching the point of repeating itself. To understand why Peruvian seismologists treat this threat as seriously as they do, you have to understand the specific tectonic setup running along almost the entire western edge of South America. Offshore, the Nazca Plate, a section of oceanic crust beneath the Pacific, is being forced underneath the continental South American plate along a deep offshore trench called the Peru-Chile Trench, in a process called subduction. This is the same basic mechanism responsible for the largest earthquakes ever recorded anywhere on the planet, including the magnitude 9.5 earthquake that struck neighboring Chile in 1960, still the most powerful earthquake ever measured by modern instruments, and the magnitude 9.1 earthquake that struck Japan in 2011. Subduction zone boundaries like this one are capable of producing earthquakes far larger than the kind generated by a fault where two plates simply slide past each other, horizontally, because an enormous surface area of locked, coupled plate boundary can rupture all at once, releasing decades or centuries of accumulated strain in a single catastrophic event. Along Peru's coastline, the Nazca Plate is diving beneath South America at a rate of roughly 7 to 8 centimeters per year, genuinely one of the faster convergence rates found at any subduction zone in the world. That speed matters enormously because it directly controls how quickly stress rebuilds along the plate boundary after each previous earthquake releases it. A faster convergence. Rate means strain accumulates faster, which generally means large earthquakes recur on a shorter timeline than they would along a slower moving boundary. Layered on top of that offshore mechanism is a second, more local factor that makes Lima specifically more vulnerable than the raw earthquake magnitude alone would suggest, the ground the city is actually built on. Much of Lima sits atop a thick basin of soft alluvial sediment, loose material deposited over thousands of years by rivers flowing down from the Andes. Soft sediment like that doesn't just transmit an earthquake's shaking, it can amplify it, the seismic waves slowing down and piling up in energy as they pass from harder underlying rock into the looser material near the surface. It's the same basic phenomenon that made the 1985 Mexico City earthquake so catastrophically destructive despite its epicenter sitting hundreds of miles away on the coast. The city's own lakebed sediment turned a distant earthquake into locally amplified, prolonged shaking. Lima's geology creates a comparable risk multiplier sitting directly beneath a metro area of roughly 11 million people. Peru's subduction zone doesn't behave uniformly along its entire length either, which is part of what makes pinpointing risk to specific segments of coastline possible in the first place. Research tracking interseismic coupling along the full Peruvian margin has found that the fault's behavior is highly heterogeneous from north to south. Shallow coupling in northern Peru tends to correspond with a different style of earthquake entirely. Slower rupturing events known as tsunami earthquakes, which can generate a disproportionately large tsunami relative to how strongly the ground actually shakes, catching coastal residents off guard because the shaking itself doesn't feel severe enough to prompt an immediate evacuation. Central and southern Peru, by contrast, show much deeper, stronger coupling, which is exactly where the historical record shows the largest and most destructive megathrust earthquakes have repeatedly originated. Segments of the plate boundary that instead creep continuously rather than staying locked tend to appear at the edges of these zones, often where underwater geological features like oceanic ridges intersect the subduction zone and seem to interrupt the buildup of strain. That segmentation isn't just an academic detail. It's exactly why seismologists can say with real confidence that the Lima-Callao segment specifically, rather than the Peruvian coast in general, represents the highest priority hazard zone in the country. This is where the story moves from general regional risk to something far more specific and, frankly, more unsettling. Seismologists studying this exact stretch of the Peruvian coast don't just look at plate convergence rates in the abstract. They use networks of GPS stations and satellite radar measurements, a technique called INSAR, to directly track how much the ground surface is deforming year over year as strain builds up along the offshore fault. Where two plates are tightly locked together, or coupled, strain accumulates steadily until it's eventually released in a large earthquake. Where the plates instead creep past each other more gradually, that strain gets released continuously in smaller, far less destructive movements. Mapping which parts of the fault are locked versus creeping lets scientists identify exactly where the next big rupture is most likely to originate. Research using this exact methodology, focused specifically on the central segment of the Peruvian coast that includes Lima, found something that should catch anyone's attention. Strong, deep coupling directly beneath the region around the capital, with peak surface deformation measured right around Lima itself before fading out on either side. That pattern, strong coupling, concentrated directly under a major population center, is precisely the signature seismologists look for when trying to identify where the next great earthquake along a subduction margin is likely to strike. And there's a specific historical target this research is measuring against: the great earthquake of 1746, a Lima-Callao megathrust event estimated at roughly magnitude 8.8, the exact same number Peru just used in this week's national drill. Using the observed coupling data along this segment of coast, researchers have estimated a recurrence interval of roughly 305 years, plus or minus about 40 years, for an earthquake capable of reproducing that 1746 event. Do the math on that, and the window scientists have identified as the plausible return period for the next Lima-scale megathrust earthquake is already open, and has been for some time. To be absolutely clear about what that does and doesn't mean, a 305-year average recurrence interval with a 40-year margin of uncertainty is not a prediction of exactly when the next earthquake will strike. Earthquake science cannot currently forecast a specific date for any fault anywhere on Earth. And Peruvian and international seismologists are consistently careful not to frame this as an imminent countdown. What it does mean is that this specific stretch of coastline sits inside the statistically expected window for its next major rupture, based on the same historical pattern it has followed for centuries. And that's precisely the kind of finding that turns an earthquake drill from a routine bureaucratic exercise into a matter of urgent national planning. The 1746 earthquake that this week's drill was explicitly modeled on isn't some obscure historical footnote. It's one of the most devastating natural disasters in South American colonial history. And understanding what it actually did helps explain why modern Peruvian officials treat the possibility of a repeat with such gravity. On the night of October 28, 1746, an enormous earthquake struck off the central Peruvian coast, violently shaking Lima and the neighboring port of Callao. The city of Lima itself, then home to tens of thousands of residents, saw the overwhelming majority of its buildings collapse or suffer severe structural damage within minutes. But it was the tsunami that followed, striking the low-lying port of Callao directly, that produced the disaster's most staggering toll. Historical accounts describe Callao as almost entirely destroyed, with only a small handful of the port's population reported to have survived the wave. Combined, the earthquake and a tsunami killed thousands of people along a coastline that, at the time, held a fraction of the population living there today. That event doesn't stand alone in the historical record either. Go back further to July 1586, and an earlier Lima-Callao earthquake, estimated around magnitude 8.1, produced a tsunami reaching roughly 5 meters in height and stands as the first major earthquake to strike Lima since the city's founding in 1535. Move forward from 1746 to October 1687, and another massive earthquake, estimated between magnitude 8.4 and 8.7, struck the same general stretch of coast, killing an estimated 5,000 people and generating a tsunami that reportedly reached as far as Japan, producing run-ups of tens of meters on the other side of the Pacific. And in more modern, instrumentally recorded history, the magnitude 8.0 earthquake that struck Pisco in August 2007 killed more than 500 people and sent a tsunami flooding directly into parts of Lima's own coastal highway system. Lay all of that out and the pattern is unmistakable. This exact stretch of coastline has produced earthquake after earthquake in the magnitude 8 range and above across 5 centuries of recorded history, each one capable of generating a locally devastating tsunami on top of the shaking itself. The 1746 event, the specific benchmark behind this week's drill, simply happens to be the largest and most destructive of that entire historical record, which is exactly why Peruvian officials chose it as the scenario worth rehearsing for. It's also worth noting that Peru's seismic activity hasn't been confined to that single historical cluster along the central coast. In November 1996, a magnitude 8.0 earthquake ruptured a segment of the subduction zone further south, where an underwater feature called the Nazca Ridge intersects the main plate boundary. A rupture, roughly 200 kilometers long, that scientists studying it found didn't behave the way older models predicted. Rupturing directly through territory some researchers had previously assumed would resist a large slip. And in 2001, a magnitude 8.4 earthquake struck the southern Peruvian coast, one of the largest instrumentally recorded earthquakes in the country's modern history. Findings like these have repeatedly forced Peruvian and international seismologists to revise their assumptions about exactly where and how this subduction margin is capable of rupturing, which is part of why continuous, updated monitoring along segments like the one beneath Lima remains such an active and evolving area of research rather than a settled question. It's worth pausing on what a magnitude 8.8 earthquake genuinely represents, because the way the Richter and moment magnitude scales work means jumping even a single full point represents a roughly 30-fold increase in the energy released, not a linear increase. An earthquake at magnitude 8.8 sits in the same broad tier as some of the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded on the planet, not far below the magnitude 9.5 Chilean earthquake of 1960, and comparable in scale to the 2011 earthquake that struck Japan and triggered the Fukushima nuclear disaster. At that scale, the shaking itself in Lima would likely last well over a minute, an almost unimaginable duration for anyone who has only experienced smaller, more localized quakes that pass in a matter of seconds. Given how close the simulated epicenter sits to shore, just 60 kilometers offshore in this scenario, a resulting tsunami could reach the coastline in a matter of minutes rather than hours, leaving residents in low-lying coastal districts like La Punta with an extremely narrow window to reach higher ground before the first wave arrives. That's precisely why this week's drill placed such heavy emphasis on rehearsing vertical evacuation into reinforced buildings rather than relying purely on horizontal evacuation routes that assume there's enough time to outrun the water. Layer onto that the specific vulnerability created by Lima's soft alluvial ground, and the picture that emerges is a capital city of roughly 11 million people facing violent, extended, locally amplified shaking, followed within minutes by a tsunami threat along its coastline, with the kind of combined casualty and displacement toll the government itself. Estimated this week, potentially over 10,000 dead, well over 100,000 injured, and more than 2 million people forced from their homes. President Fujimori's public messaging throughout the drill focused heavily on two practical themes: the fact that major earthquakes give no advance warning whatsoever, and the importance of individual household-level preparedness, rather than relying solely on government response after the fact. She specifically urged citizens to maintain a stocked emergency backpack with basic survival supplies ready to go at all times, and stressed that schools across the country need clear, rehearsed evacuation and regrouping protocols that don't depend on communication systems that a major earthquake could easily knock offline. That framing reflects a broader, harder truth about earthquake preparedness that emergency planners everywhere have to grapple with. Unlike a hurricane or a slow-building flood, there is no early warning. Window measured in days for an earthquake. The shaking simply starts, without notice, and everything that happens in the first minutes afterward depends entirely on preparation that was already in place beforehand. Evacuation routes people already know by heart, emergency supplies already gathered, and building codes and retrofitting already completed long before the ground ever moves. That's precisely why a drill of this scale, rehearsing the full sequence from initial shaking through tsunami evacuation to sustained outdoor sheltering, carries real practical value, regardless of exactly when the next major earthquake actually strikes this coast. There's also a resource allocation dimension to this preparedness push that mirrors challenges seen in other major disaster scenarios worldwide. A metro area the size of Lima, with roughly 11 million residents concentrated in a relatively compact urban footprint, would place an enormous strain on search and rescue capacity, hospital bed availability, and emergency shelter space if even a fraction of the government's simulated casualty figures came anywhere close to reality. Unlike a hurricane, where forecasters can pre-position emergency resources days in advance of landfall, an earthquake response has to be built entirely around resources that are already staged, trained, and ready to move within minutes because there's no forecast lead time to work with at all. That's a large part of why Peruvian officials have leaned so heavily on household-level and school-level preparedness in their public messaging. In the earliest, most critical hours after a megaquake like this, official emergency response capacity would almost certainly be overwhelmed, leaving individual preparation as the difference between survival and tragedy for a significant share of the population. As of this week, Peru's second national multi-hazard drill of 2026 has concluded, with participation reported across every region of the country and specific rehearsal of tsunami. Evacuation protocols completed in high-risk coastal districts like La Punta in Callao. Government officials, including President Fujimori and disaster response leadership, used the exercise to publicly reinforce the message that a magnitude 8.8 earthquake along this stretch of coast is treated as a realistic planning scenario, not a remote or exaggerated worst case, and Indesi has indicated this kind of nationwide exercise will continue to be run regularly going forward. On the scientific side, this remains an active area of ongoing research. Peru's Geophysical Institute and international research teams continue to monitor GPS and satellite deformation data along the central Peruvian coast, refining estimates of exactly how much strain has accumulated along the locked segment of the fault beneath Lima since the last major rupture. None of that monitoring can currently produce a specific predicted date for the next earthquake. What it can do, and what it has already done, is confirm that the underlying hazard behind this week's drill is grounded in real, measured geological data rather than worst-case speculation for its own sake. What makes this story worth paying attention to isn't really the drill logistics themselves. Practice evacuations, mobile command posts, and simulated casualty reports are a normal part of disaster planning in earthquake-prone countries all over the world. What makes it worth paying attention to is the specific number Peru chose to rehearse against, and the reason behind that choice. An 8.8 isn't a hypothetical worst case invented for dramatic effect. It's the magnitude of an earthquake that has already happened on this exact stretch of coastline once before. It's within the statistically expected recurrence. Window scientists have calculated for that same fault segment, and it's large enough to threaten a metro area of 11 million people with a level of destruction that this week a sitting president stood in a public square and read out loud as a real, specific casualty count. Nobody, including Peru's own scientists, can tell you whether that earthquake happens next year, in 10 years, or in 30. But the drill that just wrapped up in Lima wasn't rehearsing an imaginary disaster. It was rehearsing a documented historical event that this coastline has already produced multiple times. Preparing for the day the recurrence window scientists have already identified finally closes. We'll keep following this story as more research comes out of Peru's Geophysical Institute on exactly how much strain is built up along the Lima segment of the fault, and as officials continue refining the country's response plans based on what this week's exercise revealed. If you want to understand exactly what's happening the next time new findings come out of this region, make sure you're subscribed, because along this particular stretch of coastline, the history is clear, the science is active, and the drill Peru just ran wasn't practice for something that might never happen. It was practice for something that already has.